The wind in the New Mexico territory had a personality, and in 1879, that personality was mean. It was a relentless thief, stealing the moisture from the soil, the paint from the siding of Eliza Hart's cabin, and the hope from the faces of lesser women. It scraped across the high plains with a sound like tearing canvas, carrying grit that felt like powdered glass against the skin. This was the world Eliza inhabited, a world she had claimed as her own since the day her brother, Jacob, had been claimed by a tangle of panicked longhorns and unforgiving earth. Hart Spring Ranch was not much more than a sturdy cabin, a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind, and a dozen head of hardy cattle that knew the land as well as she did. The name was the ranch's only real boast, a reliable spring that bubbled from a fissure in the rock, a miracle of clear, sweet water in a land defined by thirst. It was this spring that made life possible, and it was this spring that made her a target. Eliza worked from the gray light of dawn to the bruised purple of dusk. Her hands were calloused, her face browned by the sun, but her eyes held a clarity that unsettled the folk in the nearby town of Cedar Mesa. They called her independent, but it was not a compliment. It was a judgment, a label for a woman who did not remarry, did not sell her land to a man with more power, and did not lower her gaze when Sheriff Asa Vance looked at her a moment too long. She was a widow in spirit, if not in fact, married to this stubborn patch of ground Jacob had left her. The isolation was a wall she had built brick by invisible brick, a defense against both pity and predation. Today, the wind was worse. It began in the late afternoon, a low moan from the west that grew into a full-throated roar. The sky, once a vast and indifferent blue, turned the color of a fading sunflower, then a sickly, dusty yellow. A sandstorm was coming. Eliza moved with an economy born of long practice. She herded the cattle into the corral near the barn, their lowing anxious and tight. She checked the shutters on the cabin, the leather hinges groaning in protest as she fastened them tight. She drew 2 extra buckets of water from the spring, the surface of the water already dimpled by falling grains of sand. By the time the storm hit, twilight was a memory. The world outside her cabin dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos of reddish-brown. The wind slammed against the door like a physical blow, and the fine dust, relentless, found its way through every tiny crack, dusting the floorboards, the table, the untouched Bible on her mantelpiece. It was a siege. Eliza lit a lantern, its steady golden glow a small rebellion against the pandemonium. She sat at her simple wooden table, a rifle resting across her lap, not out of fear of the storm, but of what the storm could hide. Men like Silas Crowell, the cattle baron whose vast herds were always thirsty, used all kinds of cover for their business. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a heavy, desperate thud against her door. Once, twice. Eliza froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Her knuckles whitened on the stock of the rifle. No one came to Heart Spring, not anymore, not in a storm like this. It could be a lost traveler, a life hanging by a thread. Or it could be trouble. The words of Martha Pike, the sheriff's sister-in-law and the town's foremost gossip, echoed in her mind. Warnings about Apache raiders, stories told with a grim relish, always ending with the same advice: never open your door after dark, especially not to an Indian. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a man's voice, lost in the gale but undeniably human. She stood, the chair scraping against the floor. The rifle felt heavy, a cold and final arbiter of choices. She could stay silent. She could pretend she was not there. Let the storm have whoever it was. It was the safe thing to do. The thing any other woman in Cedar Mesa would do. It was the thing that would keep her separate, untouched. But Jacob had never been that way. He would have opened the door. He would have said that a closed door in a storm was the same as a loaded gun aimed at a man's back. Taking a deep breath that tasted of dust and lamp oil, Eliza leaned the rifle against the wall next to the door. She slid the heavy wooden bar from its brackets. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it inward with a deafening crack. A figure stumbled in, half falling, shielding another, frailer man from the storm's fury. The wind howled through the opening, extinguishing her lantern in a single gust, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the swirling, ghostly dust outside. Eliza threw her shoulder against the door, fighting the storm's power. The man who had entered turned immediately to help her, his strength surprising. Together, they forced the door shut, and she dropped the bar back into place, the heavy thud sealing them inside. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the scream of the wind. Eliza fumbled for a match, her hands trembling slightly. The flame sputtered, then caught on the wick of the lantern, casting a growing circle of light. The man was Apache. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone that seemed forged by this very landscape. His face was stark, with high cheekbones and a mouth set in a grim line of exhaustion. His dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. They took in the rifle by the door, the tidy but sparse cabin, and Eliza herself, all in a single, sweeping glance. He was supporting an older man, whose face was a mask of gray fatigue. The old man's breath came in shallow, rattling rasps, and he leaned heavily against the younger one, his eyes closed. "Water," the younger man said. His voice was low and rough, the English words carefully formed. Eliza nodded, her own throat suddenly tight and dry. She moved to the bucket she had drawn and ladled water into a tin cup, her movement stiff. She held it out. The man took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. He knelt, lifting his father's head with impossible gentleness. "Father," he murmured, the word soft, in a language Eliza did not understand. He tipped the cup to the old man's lips. The father, red clay, drank weakly, some of the water spilling down his chin. Eliza watched them, a knot of fear and something else, something she could not name, tightening in her stomach. The whispers of Cedar Mesa were loud in her ears, a chorus of warnings and hatred. But what she saw was not a savage from a campfire story. She saw a son caring for his dying father. The son, Chayton, looked up at her, his eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and profound weariness. "The storm. My father. He is sick." "I can see," Eliza said, her voice quieter than she intended. She gestured to the simple cot in the corner. "Lay him down." Chayton eased his father onto the bed. Red clay sank into the thin mattress with a soft groan, his body trembling with a feverish chill. Eliza felt a pang of pity so sharp it was like a physical pain. She turned away, stoking the fire in the hearth, adding another piece of juniper. The wood caught, crackling and releasing its clean, sharp scent into the dusty air. The cabin felt small, crowded with the presence of these two strangers and the weight of their history, a history Eliza knew only through the distorted lens of her neighbors. Chayton stood by his father, a silent, watchful guardian. He had not taken his eyes off her, his posture wary, ready for any sign of threat. He was a man who had learned not to trust. Eliza understood that. Trust was a currency she rarely dealt in herself. "He has a fever," she stated, moving closer. She reached out, intending to feel the old man's forehead. But Chayton shifted, subtly placing himself in her way. His movement was not aggressive, but it was an unmistakable barrier. Eliza stopped, letting her hand fall to her side. "I have herbs," she said quietly, "for lung fever. My mother taught me." Chayton's gaze flickered from her face to his father, whose breathing was growing more labored. The sound was a terrible, wet crackle, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. The conflict was plain on his face, the deep, ingrained suspicion of a white person's medicine against the desperate need to save his father. "What herbs?" he asked, his voice low and suspicious. "Mullein and horehound, to clear the chest, and willow bark for the fever." She met his gaze without flinching. "They will not harm him. They may help." For a long minute, he said nothing. The only sounds the fire, the wind, and his father's struggle for air. Finally, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped aside. Eliza took it as the profound gesture of trust it was. She moved to a small wooden chest at the foot of her own bed and retrieved several dried bunches of herbs. As she steeped them in a pot of hot water over the fire, the small cabin filled with their earthy, medicinal scent. The tension in the room remained thick enough to taste, a compound of fear, suspicion, and the shared vulnerability of being trapped by the storm. Chayton watched her every move, his expression unreadable. His goal was simple: primal, keep his father alive. He had been trying to get him to the warmer, lower elevations, away from the reservation where the government agents' promises were as thin as the winter blankets they provided. They were supposed to be free, but freedom was just another word for starving slowly when the agency men held all the cards. This woman, this solitary white woman, was an unexpected complication, a potential danger he had been forced to embrace. For Eliza, her own goals felt distant. The long-term struggle to keep her spring from the covetous eyes of Silas Crowell, a man who saw water not as life but as profit, seemed an abstract problem for another day. Her immediate goal was to survive this night, to weather this storm both outside and inside her home. She strained the tea into a cup and brought it to the bedside. "Help me sit him up," she said to Chayton. Together, they gently raised red clay. The old man's eyes fluttered open, clouded with fever. Eliza held the cup to his lips, speaking softly, her tone soothing. "Drink this. It will help you breathe." He sipped the bitter liquid, his gaze finding hers. For a moment, the feverish haze seemed to clear, and she saw a flicker of profound wisdom in their depths, the gaze of a man who had seen the turning of many seasons. Then he sank back, his breathing already seeming a fraction easier. Eliza and Chayton worked in a shared, silent rhythm, bathing Red Clay's face with a cool cloth, adjusting his blankets. An unspoken truce settled between them, born of a common purpose. The storm raged on, a wild beast trying to claw its way inside. Later, as the fire burned low, Eliza sat at the table, cleaning her rifle, the familiar, methodical action a comfort. Chayton sat on a stool by the hearth, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The rasp of steel on stone was a steady, rhythmic sound against the howl of the wind. Suddenly, Chayton stopped. He lifted his head, his body instantly alert, like a deer scenting a predator. Eliza saw the change and went still herself, her ears straining. Over the din of the storm, she heard it too, a sound that pierced the gale's roar for just a second. The unmistakable, muffled whinny of a horse. It was close, too close. Not the sound of a lost animal, but of a horse being held in check, its rider waiting. Chayton's eyes met hers across the dimly lit room. The suspicion was back, but this time it was not directed at her. It was a shared understanding. They were not alone out here. The storm had brought them together, but it had also brought watchers. Someone, one of Sheriff Vance's men perhaps, was out there in the screaming dark, observing her small cabin, noting the presence of her unexpected guests. Eliza's hand tightened on her rifle. She had opened her door out of compassion. She was beginning to understand that on this frontier, in this territory of greed and prejudice, an act of mercy could be seen as an act of war. The night was far from over. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The wind had died, leaving behind a world remade in a single color, a dull, oppressive red. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, the blades of grama grass, the leaves of the struggling cottonwood by the spring, the rough wood of the cabin itself. It was a silent, suffocating blanket that muted the landscape. The sun climbed a hazy sky, its light diffused and weak, as if shining through a sheet of dirty glass. Inside the cabin, the air was still thick with a scent of herbs and wood smoke. Red Clay's breathing was steadier, the terrible rattling in his chest diminished to a low rumble. Eliza's remedies had pulled him back from the edge, but he was far from safe. The fever still clung to him, a dry heat radiating from his skin. He needed stronger medicine, the kind that came in a bottle from the town apothecary, not just what she could gather from the hills. Eliza and Chayton moved around the small space in a careful, unspoken dance. He had thanked her at dawn, not with many words, but with a look of profound, weary gratitude that spoke more than a speech. He had chopped firewood for her, his movements fluid and powerful, and had checked her small herd with an expert eye, pointing out a fence post the storm had loosened. She, in turn, had shared her coffee and the last of her cornbread. A fragile bridge of mutual respect was being built, plank by silent plank, over a chasm of mistrust. "I have to go to town," she announced, breaking the quiet, "to Cedar Mesa, for medicine." She looked at Chayton. "He cannot travel. You should stay with him." Chayton shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Where my father is, I am—" He paused, his eyes sweeping the cabin, acknowledging the sanctuary she had given them. "Where you go, I go. It is not safe for you to ride alone after this." She knew he was right. The whinny of the horse in the storm was a warning. Going to town was a necessity, but it was also a risk. To arrive with an Apache man at her side would be like throwing a lit match into a dry tinderbox. The gossip would catch fire instantly. But to leave him here, with his sick father, while a watcher might still be lurking, was unthinkable. It would make them vulnerable, and it would betray the trust they had begun to build. "All right," she said, her decision made, "we ride together." The journey to Cedar Mesa was tense. They left Red Clay sleeping, a bucket of fresh water and a bowl of broth by his cot. The land around them was stark and thirsty. The dust rose in red clouds from their horses' hooves. Eliza rode her steady buckskin mare, while Chayton rode a lean, tough-looking Mustang that moved with a restless energy, as if it preferred the open plains to any man-made trail. They rode in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the low mesas, the shadowed arroyos. They were two solitary figures moving through a vast, indifferent landscape. Cedar Mesa appeared as a smudge on the horizon, slowly resolving into a collection of low, false-fronted buildings huddled along a single dusty street. It was a town that always seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next gunshot or the next flash flood. As they rode down the main street, a palpable silence fell. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. Faces appeared in windows, staring, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and hostility. A dog that had been sleeping in the sun got to its feet and slunk away, its tail between its legs. Eliza felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes. She lifted her chin, her back straight in the saddle, refusing to show the unease that churned in her gut. Chayton rode beside her, his face an impassive mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the knife on his belt. He was a man entering enemy territory, and he knew it. Before they dismounted at the general store, Eliza's gaze was drawn to the town notice board. It was cluttered with announcements, land claims, and faded posters for county fairs. But one notice, freshly posted, stood out in bold black letters. It offered a $50 reward from the territorial government for the capture and delivery of any Apache raider, a sum that could feed a family for months. It was a legal document, a government sanction that turned prejudice into profit. It was a hunting license. Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the heat. She tore her eyes away and swung down from her horse. "Wait here," she said to Chayton, her voice low. "I will be quick." He simply nodded, his eyes never leaving the street, watching, always watching. The bell above the door of Miller's Mercantile jingled, announcing her arrival. The store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and lye soap. Samuel Miller, a man whose spine seemed to have been permanently bent from leaning over his counter, looked up. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Chayton through the window, standing with the horses. "Eliza," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too hearty. "What can I get for you on this dusty day?" "I need a bottle of Dr. Caldwell's lung balsam, Samuel, and some quinine." Before he could answer, the bell jingled again. Martha Pike swept in, a basket on her arm. She was Sheriff Vance's sister-in-law, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in a look of disapproval. Her eyes immediately landed on Eliza, then flickered to the window, her lips thinning into a straight, venomous line. "Well, Eliza Hart," she said, her voice carrying across the store, "I see you have found yourself some interesting company. I always knew you had a taste for the wild things. It is a shame what happens to a woman left alone for too long. She forgets her place." The air in the store grew thick and still. Samuel Miller suddenly became very busy arranging a stack of canned peaches. Eliza turned slowly, her heart pounding a heavy, angry rhythm against her ribs. "My company is my own business, Martha, and the only thing I have forgotten is how much I value your opinion." Martha's face flushed a blotchy red. "It will be the town's business soon enough. Harboring a stray. Who knows what sickness he carries or what crimes he is running from?" Just then, the door opened again, and a different kind of power entered the room. Silas Crowell was a big man, not with fat, but with the solid, imposing bulk of a bull. He wore a fine coat despite the heat, and his boots were polished to a high shine. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, and he had been trying to buy Hart's Spring for the better part of a year. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Ladies," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "No need for harsh words. Eliza, I heard about the storm out your way. Nasty business. Must be difficult, managing all on your own." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "I want you to know my offer still stands. A fair price for your land. A good price. You could move into town, live comfortably, be safe." His words were like silk wrapped around a stone. He was offering her a cage, gilded and comfortable, in exchange for the one thing that gave her life, meaning her freedom, her water. "My answer still stands. Silas," Eliza said, her voice clear and steady. "Heart Spring is not for sale." Crowell's smile tightened at the edges. Before he could reply, the bell above the door rang for a fourth time, and the law walked in. Sheriff Asa Vance was a man who had gone to seed, his face florid, his belly straining the buttons of his vest. He carried the smell of whiskey and self-importance with him like a cheap cologne. He was followed by his deputy, a lanky, brutal-looking man named E.P.H. Kincaid, whose hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver strapped to his hip. Vance's eyes swept the room, lingering on Crowell with a look of shared understanding, before settling on Eliza. "Hart," he said, his voice gravelly. "I heard you had visitors." His gaze shifted to the window, and his eyes narrowed. "That Apache out there. He got a pass to be off the reservation." This was it. The moment she had been dreading. This was not about a piece of paper. It was about power. It was about Vance reminding everyone in this town, and especially her, who was in charge. Eliza felt a tremor of fear, but she pushed it down, turning it into cold anger. She thought of Chayton's gentleness with his father, of the dignity in his silence. "He is a guest in my home. Sheriff, his father is gravely ill. They were caught in the storm." Vance sneered. "That is not what I asked. Does he have a pass?" The entire store was silent, watching. This was a public trial, and she was the one being judged. She could back down. She could apologize, send Chayton away, and hope they would leave her in peace. But she knew they would not. Appeasing men like Vance and Crowell was like feeding a wolf. It only made it hungrier. A voice she barely recognized as her own, strong and unwavering, filled the silence. "According to territorial law, Sheriff, any person has the right to offer humanitarian sanctuary to another in the event of a natural disaster or medical emergency. The sandstorm was a natural disaster. The man's father has lung fever. That is a medical emergency. No pass is required under these circumstances. A collective gasp went through the small audience. Vance's face darkened, the red deepening to a dangerous purple. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman, and certainly not with the law he was supposed to represent. "Is that so?" he growled. "You an attorney now?" "Hart." "She is correct." The new voice was soft, yet it cut through the tension like a sharp knife. Mistress Lian Chen stood near the back of the store, a basket of perfectly folded laundry in her arms. She ran the town's laundry service, a small, quiet woman who was often overlooked, but her eyes were bright with an intelligence that missed nothing. She looked directly at Sheriff Vance. The Territorial Statute of 1876, Article 4, Provision for Aid. It is quite clear. Vance stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had no authority over Mistress Chen, who was respected for her diligence and her quiet refusal to be intimidated. Mistress Chen then turned her calm gaze to Eliza. "If the sheriff continues to trouble you," she said, her voice still quiet but resonant, "you should send a letter by wire to the federal attorney in Santa Fe. I am told he is a very reasonable man who takes his duties very seriously." It was a masterstroke. She had not only supported Eliza but had also invoked a higher, more powerful authority, one that Vance could not ignore. The threat of federal oversight was the one thing that could make a small-town tyrant like Asa Vance hesitate. The sheriff stood there, his jaw working silently. He was trapped. To arrest Chayton now would be a direct defiance of the law Eliza and Mistress Chen had so publicly cited. He shot a look of pure venom at Eliza, a look that promised retribution. "This is not over," he muttered, his voice low and menacing. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked at EPH Kincaid. In a voice just loud enough for Eliza to hear, he said, "Keep an eye on things out at the Hart place. EPH, make sure our guests do not overstay their welcome. Teach them some manners if you have to." Then he was gone, the bell jangling furiously behind him. Crowell gave Eliza one last, long look, a look that was both a threat and an appraisal, before following the sheriff out. The spell was broken. Martha Pike, without another word, turned and marched out of the store. Samuel Miller finally finished arranging his peaches and hurried to get Eliza's medicine, his hands shaking slightly. Eliza paid for her items, her own hands surprisingly steady. She exchanged a brief, grateful look with Mistress Chen, a silent acknowledgement of an alliance newly forged. Then she walked out of the store and into the dusty sunlight. Chayton was where she had left him, his posture unchanged, but his eyes were fixed on her. He had seen everything through the window. He had seen her stand up to the most powerful men in town. He had seen a white woman risk her own safety to defend him, for the first time since she had met him. The hard, wary guard in his eyes softened, replaced by something akin to wonder. Without a word, she handed him the small paper bag. He took it, and for a moment, their fingers touched. It was a small, fleeting contact, but in the charged air of Cedar Mesa, it felt as powerful as a shout. They mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the hate-filled stares behind them. The silence on the ride home now filled with a new and complicated weight. Eliza Hart had found her voice, and in doing so, had drawn a line in the dust of the New Mexico territory, a line that she knew her enemies were already planning to cross. The return to Hart's Spring was a silent retreat into a shared bubble of defiance. The dust of Cedar Mesa seemed to cling to them, a fine red powder of judgment and hate. But inside the fence line of the ranch, the world shrank to the cabin, the barn, and the endless, watchful sky. A new rhythm began, not of host and guests, but of partners in a quiet siege. Life on the frontier did not pause for threats. It demanded to be lived, tended to, and defended, one sunrise at a time. The days that followed were measured in sweat and labor. The medicine from town worked slowly, pulling Red Clay back from the fevered depths, leaving him weak but lucid. While he rested, Chayton and Eliza worked. There was a fence line to the north that the storm had battered. snapping 2 posts and leaving the wire sagging like a forgotten clothesline. They rode out together, the air crisp and clean after the dust had settled. Eliza worked with a familiar efficiency, digging new post holes with a strength born of solitary effort. Chayton, however, moved with an intuitive grace, seeing the stress points in the wire, the best way to brace the posts against the prevailing wind. He taught her how to splice the wire with a neat, strong twist that would not break under strain, his large, calloused hands guiding hers for a moment. In that brief contact, there was no threat, only the shared purpose of mending what was broken. The barn roof had taken a beating, a section of shingles torn away by the wind, leaving a dark, gaping hole. Eliza had planned a clumsy patch of canvas and tar. Chayton looked at it, then went into the sparse woods that grew along the seasonal creek bed, returning with cured juniper branches and a length of rawhide from his saddle pack. He sat for an hour, patiently splitting the wood into rough shakes, trimming them with his knife. Then, with an agility that surprised her, he climbed onto the roof and began weaving the shakes into the existing shingles, securing them with thin, incredibly strong strips of the rawhide. He was not just patching the roof, he was making it stronger, using the materials of the land itself. Watching him work, Eliza felt a pang of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, the quiet comfort of not being entirely alone in her struggle. One afternoon, he found her cleaning her brother's old Spencer carbine. It was a good rifle, reliable, but heavy, and she was never as accurate with it as she was with her smaller Winchester. He watched her for a moment, his dark eyes assessing. "Your shoulder," he said, pointing. "You hold it too tight. You fight the rifle, so the rifle fights you back." She paused, a bit of oil on a rag in her hand, a defensive retort on her lips, but she held it back. She had seen him handle the rifle he carried, the way it seemed an extension of his own body. She nodded. "Show me." He took the carbine from her, its weight seeming to diminish in his hands. He stood behind her, his voice low, close to her ear. "Breathe out when you pull the trigger. Do not hold your breath. Let the air out. Let the shot go with it." He adjusted her stance, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder to correct her posture. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a tremor through her. "The rifle is a tool, like a shovel or an axe. You do not fight your axe. You guide it, guide the bullet." They spent an hour with empty cans set on a distant fence post. He made her practice the breathing, the feel of the trigger, the way the stock should sit against her shoulder. And when she finally did shoot, the recoil felt different. A solid, manageable push instead of a vicious kick. The can flew off the post. A slow smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded. Chayton gave a small nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of her strength and her willingness to grow stronger. The nights were the best time. The desert air cooled quickly, and the sky became a vast expanse of diamond dust. They would build a small fire outside the cabin, the flames pushing back the immense, silent darkness. Red Clay, wrapped in a thick blanket, would join them, his voice gaining a little of its strength each evening. He was a storyteller, a keeper of the old ways, and in the flickering firelight, the cabin at Heart Spring became a different place. One night, as the coyotes sang their lonely songs in the hills, he began to speak of the spirit web. "In the beginning," he said, his voice a soft rasp, "the Creator spun the world from his thoughts, but the threads were loose, so he wove everything together. The rock is woven to the tree to the deer to the hunter to his family, the family to the earth. There is no single thread that is not connected to all others." He held up his thin, trembling hand. "When one thread is pulled, the whole web shivers." He looked from Eliza to his son, his eyes deep and knowing. Sometimes, a thread is cut by sickness, or by a knife. The web is torn, but it can be mended. New threads can be woven. A stranger can become family. An enemy can become a protector. The web wants to be whole. Life wants to be whole. The story settled in the quiet between them. as profound and real as the stars above. It gave a name to what was happening in this small, isolated place. They were 3 loose threads, blown together by a storm, slowly, cautiously weaving themselves into something new. The intimacy of the firelight seemed to loosen their tongues, and the secrets they held began to surface. Eliza, emboldened by the old man's words, finally asked the question that had been hovering at the edge of her thoughts. "Chayton," she said softly, "the men on the reservation, the agency, why did you leave?" Chayton stared into the fire, his face a mask of old pains. "I was a scout," he said, his voice low, heavy with the weight of the confession. "For the cavalry, I thought I could walk in both worlds. I thought I could guide them, show them the way of peace, be a bridge." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "I was a fool. I saw the truth. The agents, the suppliers, they were thieves. They were given good beef, good flour, warm blankets for our people, but they signed papers for the good supplies, and then sold them to miners and settlers. They gave us the spoiled meat, the flour full of weevils, the blankets so thin you could read a newspaper through them. They were stealing the life from our children, from our elders. One stolen meal at a time." Red Clay spoke, his voice thin but clear. "I spoke out. I told the agent he had the heart of a coyote, who eats his own kind when he is hungry. I told him the Creator saw his black deeds." The old man coughed, a dry, racking sound. "For this, they called me a troublemaker. They drove us from our small piece of land. They said we had broken their law. The only law we broke was the law of silence." Chayton took over, his words clipped and hard. "I saw what they were. I saw that the uniform I wore was just a different kind of trap. I was not a bridge. I was the dog that helped the wolf find the sheep. So I left. I took my father, and we walked away. We chose to be hungry and free, rather than fed and chained." The silence that followed was heavy with the truth of his words. Eliza felt a wave of shame for the ignorance of her own people, and a surge of admiration for the courage of these 2 men. His confession demanded one of her own, the secret of her own vulnerability, the chain that was wrapped around her own land. "My brother, Jacob," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man, but not always a wise one. The year before he died, we had a drought. We needed money for feed, to dig the well a little deeper. He went to Silas Crowell." She looked at Chayton, wanting him to understand. "He borrowed $500. Crowell was so friendly, so helpful. The papers Jacob signed. I read them after he was gone. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to read. The interest, it doubles every year he called the note due. And there is a clause. In small print, it says if the payment is 1 day late, the deed to Heart Spring becomes his property, for the price of the original loan. Not the debt, the loan." She was trapped. The debt was a snake coiled around the heart of her ranch, and Silas Crowell's hand was resting on its head, waiting for the right moment to let it strike. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. They were both caught, she and Chayton. He was a fugitive from the slow violence of the reservation, and she was a captive of the predatory laws of so-called civilized men. They were bound by different chains, but they were chained all the same. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. Her fear of being labeled the woman who kept an Indian in her house seemed a small, petty thing compared to the raw courage of their story. And Chayton, who had feared bringing the agency's wrath or the town's violence down upon her, now saw that she was already in a fight for her life. His presence had not brought the danger. It had only revealed the danger that was already there. In that moment, by the dying fire, they made a silent choice. They would trust each other. They would face these threats together. The next morning, the new resolve felt solid, real. They took the small herd to the spring, the cattle drinking deeply of the clear, cool water. As Eliza watched them, a splash of color on the gray rocks at the far side of the pool caught her eye. It was a jarring, unnatural red, the color of fresh paint. She walked closer, her boots crunching on the gravelly soil. It was a crudely painted X, slapped onto the face of the rock about 10 feet from where the water bubbled up from the earth. It was fresh. She could still smell the faint chemical scent of it. "Chayton," she called, her voice tight with a sudden, cold dread. He was at her side in an instant. He knelt, studying the mark. His eyes missing nothing, he touched the edge of it, then looked at the ground, at the faint, almost invisible scuff marks of a man's boots. "This is not a wanderer's mark," he said, his voice grim. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the surrounding hills. "This is a surveyor's mark, a claim. Someone is measuring your water." Eliza's heart went cold. It was Crowell. He was not waiting for the debt to come due. He was making his move now. The painted X was a declaration of war, a sign that the quiet siege was over. The battle for Heart Spring had just begun. The discovery of the painted X changed the air at Heart Spring. It was no longer a place of cautious healing, but a silent, watchful fort. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting long, predatory shadows from the low mesas. Every rustle of the wind in the dry grass sounded like a footstep, every distant cry of a hawk like a signal. They ate their sparse evening meal in near silence. The Spencer carbine leaning against the wall by the door, a third presence at the table. Chayton sat facing the single window, his stillness that of a rock, yet every muscle in his body seemed coiled. Ready. Night fell completely, a heavy, moonless blanket at first. Later, a sliver of moon would rise, casting a pale, ghostly light. Inside, Eliza lit only one lantern, keeping the wick turned low. The small pool of light made the surrounding darkness in the corners of the cabin seem deeper, more absolute. Red Clay was asleep on his cot, his breathing a fragile rhythm in the tense quiet. The sound came around midnight, not a direct approach, but the soft, deliberate tread of several horses picking their way through the rocky terrain to the south. Chayton was on his feet before the sound had fully registered in Eliza's mind, moving with a silent, fluid grace to the window. He peered through a tiny gap in the shutters. Eliza rose, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She picked up the carbine, the wood smooth and familiar against her hands. She did not ask what he saw. She knew. A rough voice carried on the night air, thick with whiskey and malice. It was E.P.H. Kincaid. He called out a taunt, his words ugly, about the kind of company Eliza was keeping. Another man laughed, a high, nervous sound. They were not hiding. This was not an attack meant to kill. Not yet. It was a performance of terror, meant to break her will. Suddenly, a shot rang out, a whip crack of sound that shattered the night. A splinter of wood flew from the door frame, inches from the shuttered window. The message was clear. "We are here. We can reach you whenever we want." On the cot, Red Clay gasped, a strangled, tearing sound. The shock of the gunshot had thrown his body into a panic. He began to cough, a deep, racking spasm that shook his thin frame. He fought for breath, his face turning a dusky gray in the dim lamplight, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the men outside. Eliza was torn. Her every instinct screamed to face the threat at her door, but the more immediate crisis was the dying man in her cabin. She rushed to his side, lifting his head, murmuring soothing words she did not feel. Chayton turned from the window, his face a stark mask of fury and fear. He saw his father struggling, and the sound of that fight for air was more terrible than any gunshot. They had to do something. They were trapped, pinned down by the light of a single lantern that made them a perfect target. A second shot splintered the wood of the shutter, closer this time. An idea, born of desperation and memory, sparked in Eliza's mind. Her mother's silver-backed hand mirror. She looked at Chayton, her eyes wide in the gloom. She pointed to the lamp, then made a quick, extinguishing motion with her hand. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. He moved to the hearth, grabbing a heavy blanket, while Eliza pinched the wick of the lantern, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. The only light was the faint, milky starlight filtering through the cracks. The sudden blackness was disorienting. Outside, a confused voice asked what had happened. Kincaid cursed, telling them to hold their fire. Eliza fumbled in the dark, her hands finding the small wooden chest where she kept her few precious things. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth oval of the mirror. She crept to the cabin's second window, the one on the opposite wall, the one that faced away from the main direction of the attack. Chayton was there, holding the blanket. He understood. This was about misdirection. Outside, the moon had begun to rise, a pale crescent that offered just enough light to see shapes against the sky. A man on horseback, likely Kincaid, shouted for them to light the lamp again, his voice laced with angry impatience. Another man suggested they just rush the cabin. Eliza took a deep, steadying breath. She opened the shutter just a crack. She held the mirror at an angle, catching the faint moonlight, and reflected a small, shimmering patch of light onto the inside wall of the barn, 100 feet away. It was a weak, wavering light, but in the profound darkness of the plains, it was as noticeable as a bonfire. She moved it slightly, making it dance and flicker, like a lantern being carried by a nervous hand. A man outside gave a shout. He had seen it. He said someone was in the barn. Kincaid's voice, full of authority, ordered 2 of his men to circle around and check. The sounds of their horses moving off into the darkness was a small victory. They had split their forces. Now the men who remained were focused on the barn. Kincaid yelled at whoever he thought was in there to come out, to give them a better view. One of the men lit a storm lantern he carried, its bright yellow eye cutting through the gloom. It was a foolish, arrogant mistake. It made him a perfect target. From the window beside Eliza, there was a soft click as Chayton cocked his rifle. He had been waiting, as patient as a hunting cat. He had not been fooled by her trick. He had been using the cover it provided. He let out a long, slow breath, just as he had taught her. The rifle fired, the sound impossibly loud inside the cabin. It was not a shot at a man. It was a shot at the light. Outside, the storm lantern exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. Darkness fell again, sudden and complete. There were shouts of surprise and pain as hot oil splashed. Kincaid roared in fury and confusion. He fired a wild shot toward the cabin, the bullet whining harmlessly over the roof. But the fight had gone out of them. They were in the dark. Their leader was angry, and their simple plan of intimidation had been turned against them. They had been outmaneuvered. After a few moments of shouted curses and milling confusion, Eliza heard the sound she had been praying for, the thunder of horses' hooves, retreating at a gallop, fading into the west. Silence returned, thick and heavy. For a long time, neither she nor Chayton moved. They listened, straining to hear any sound that suggested the men were circling back. But there was nothing, only the wind and the frantic, relieved beating of her own heart. Eliza turned from the window and relit her own lamp, her hands shaking. Chayton was already at his father's side. Red Clay's breathing was still labored, but the immediate, life-threatening crisis had passed. The old man's eyes were closed, his face slick with sweat. The night had taken a heavy toll. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a cruel mockery of the night's violence. The rising sun illuminated the scars of the attack, the splintered wood on the door, the shattered glass of the attacker's lantern near the corral. By mid-morning, just as Eliza knew he would, Sheriff Vance arrived, EPH Kincaid riding beside him. Vance dismounted, his face a mask of official concern that did not fool Eliza for a second. Kincaid stayed on his horse, a smug, triumphant look on his face. His left hand was bandaged. The sheriff announced that he had heard reports of gunfire out at her place during the night. He was just there to investigate, to make sure everything was all right. His words were a lie, and they both knew it. This was the second act of the intimidation. He insisted on looking around, Eliza had no legal standing to stop him. She stood on her porch, her arms crossed, her face set like stone, and watched as he poked around her property. He was not searching for evidence. He was taking inventory, his eyes lingering on her healthy cattle, on the steady flow of the spring. Chayton remained inside with his father, out of sight but a palpable presence. Vance was careful not to try the cabin door. Just as the sheriff was finishing his pointless inspection, a wagon appeared on the track from town. It was Mistress Chen, her slight form perched on the wagon seat. She pulled up and gave a small, polite nod to the sheriff, her face calm and unreadable. She told Eliza, in a voice loud enough for Vance to hear, that she had been meaning to come out to check on her after that terrible storm. She had brought a small sack of rice and some tea, and a bundle of freshly laundered linens that Eliza had left with her weeks ago. Vance watched her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he could find no fault in a neighborly visit. He grunted that he was finished and mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he gave Eliza one last parting shot. He advised her that it was a dangerous world for a woman alone. Unsavory characters were about. She should be careful about who she let under her roof. With that, he and Kincaid rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent threats hanging in the air. Mistress Chen waited until they were out of sight. Then she handed the bundle of clean linens to Eliza. Her hand squeezed Eliza's for a fraction of a second. "The bottom fold," she whispered, her eyes full of meaning. Then, in a normal voice, she said she could not stay, and with another polite nod, she turned her wagon and headed back to town. Eliza took the linens inside. Her heart was pounding. She unfolded the last clean sheet. Tucked inside was a thick, sealed envelope. She broke the seal, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a letter, written in a clear, decisive hand. It was from an attorney in Santa Fe. She read it once, then twice, the words sinking in, each sentence a stone being laid in a new foundation of hope. The lawyer had reviewed a copy of the loan agreement she had sent with Mistress Chen. He was direct. The clause that granted Crowell her land for the price of the original loan upon a single day's default was a form of usury, and it was illegal under territorial statute. It could be challenged in court. And then came the second, more powerful blow. He wrote that, under the doctrine of prior appropriation, the first person to use a water source for a beneficial purpose gains the right to that water. Heart Spring, having been used continuously by her family for years, was legally her property. The right to the water was hers, as long as she could prove its continuous and beneficial use. Crowell's painted X was meaningless. The water was not his to measure, not his to claim. Eliza sank onto a chair. The letter clutched in her hand. The paper felt solid, real, a weapon as powerful as the rifle that still leaned against her wall. The night had been a lesson in the brutal reality of the frontier, a lesson that kindness and compassion had to be defended with a ready gun and a steady hand. But the letter was a different kind of lesson. It was a promise that justice was not just an abstract idea. It was a thing of paper and ink, of laws and statutes, a shield that could be wielded by those brave enough to hold it. The West, she was learning, required both, and for the first time in a very long time, Eliza Hart felt she might just have what it took to master them. The lawyer's letter lay on the table, a stark, white rectangle against the dark, worn wood. It was a shield, but a shield was useless if one did not lift it. The night attack had been a brutal lesson, and the sheriff's false visit a calculated insult. Heart Spring was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the predators were circling. Eliza knew they could not stay. Kincaid would be back, and next time he would not be satisfied with shooting at lanterns. And Red Clay, though his fever had broken, was fading. The deep, rattling cough had returned, and a profound weariness had settled in his bones. He needed more than herbs and bottled medicine. He needed a different kind of healing. She remembered the stories her brother Jacob used to tell of his friend, Miguel Ortega. Miguel was a vaquero of the old school, a man whose knowledge of horses, cattle, and desert remedies was woven into his very being. His family had a poultice, Jacob had said, made of boiled yucca root and a secret mix of desert herbs that could draw the deepest sickness out of a man's chest. Miguel's small ranch was 2 days' ride to the south, a world away from the spite of Cedar Mesa. The letter presented another journey, one of law and ink. The documents to file her claim on the water rights needed to be registered at the county courthouse, which lay in the same southerly direction. The two destinations, one for healing and one for justice, created a single, necessary path. She explained her plan to Chayton as the morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor. She laid out the dual purpose of the journey, the hope for his father, the fight for her land. He listened without interruption, his face impassive, but his eyes followed her every move, gauging her resolve. When she finished, he simply nodded. There was no other choice. To stay was to die, either quickly from a bullet or slowly from the strangulation of Crowell's greed. They prepared to leave with a quiet, focused urgency. Chayton fashioned a travois from 2 long poles and a buffalo hide, a simple conveyance that could be pulled behind Eliza's calmest mare to give his father as smooth a ride as possible. Eliza packed what little food they had, dried jerky, a small sack of cornmeal, and a water skin she filled to the brim at the spring. She wrapped the lawyer's letter and the other documents in an oilskin pouch and tucked it deep inside her saddlebag. It was her ammunition, as vital as the cartridges for the Spencer carbine. As they were about to leave, with the red clay settled as comfortably as possible on the travois, the old man reached out a frail hand and caught his son's arm. His eyes, though clouded with sickness, were clear and sharp. He spoke, his voice a dry whisper, in the Apache tongue. Then he looked at Eliza and switched to a few careful English words, wanting her to be a witness to his counsel. He spoke to Chayton, but his gaze included her. He said, "Do not let your heart turn to stone again. The desert is full of stone. The world does not need one more. A man who is only stone cannot feel the sun. He cannot give shelter. He can only be a weapon, and a weapon alone cannot build a home." A flicker of some old, deep pain crossed Chayton's face before he masked it with his usual stoicism. He placed his hand over his father's and murmured a reply in their own language, a promise and a reassurance. But Eliza had seen the wound the old man's words had touched. She had wondered about the hardness in him, the wall he kept around himself. It was not cruelty, but a shield of a different kind, one forged in a fire she could only imagine. The journey was hard from the first mile. The land was unforgiving, a vast expanse of rock and sun-baked earth. A thunderstorm had passed through the high country 2 nights before, a distant, silent flicker of lightning from their perspective at the ranch. Down here, the results were more dramatic. The river they needed to cross, normally a placid, shallow stream at this time of year, was a churning, muddy torrent. It was impassable, a brown, angry snake blocking their path south. Eliza felt a surge of despair. To turn back was impossible. To wait for the river to recede could take days. Time red clay did not have. Chayton, however, seemed untroubled. He dismounted and walked the riverbank for a mile, his eyes reading the current, the debris, the shape of the land. He was not looking at the obstacle. He was looking for the opportunity. He returned an hour later, pointing to a place where the river broadened and a line of ancient, half-submerged boulders created a natural breakwater. It was still dangerous, the water deep and swift, but it was possible. The crossing was a nightmare of straining horses and roaring water. Chayton led the way, his Mustang fighting the current with a fierce determination. Eliza followed with the mare pulling the travois, her knuckles white on the reins, her heart in her throat. The water pulled at the poles, trying to snatch red clay from them. At the deepest point, the mare lost her footing, and for one terrifying moment, Eliza thought they would all be swept away. But Chayton was there, already on the other side, and he plunged back into the water. grabbing the mare's bridle and hauling her, and the travois, toward the safety of the far bank. They collapsed on the muddy shore, soaked and shivering, but they were across. They pressed on, climbing from the river valley into the high, broken country of the mesas. By the second day, they entered a long, narrow pass that the old maps called Devil's Cut. The name was fitting. The trail twisted through a canyon with sheer red rock walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out the sun and amplifying every sound. The air was still and close, and the ground was littered with fallen rocks. A sense of being watched, of being in a trap, settled over Eliza. The attack came without warning. A single rifle shot echoed through the canyon, and the horse pulling the travois screamed and fell, a dark stain spreading on its shoulder. The travois tilted violently, and Red Clay cried out in pain. Almost immediately, figures appeared on the rim of the canyon above them. E.P.H. Kincaid was there, his left arm in a sling, his face contorted with hate. With him were 3 other men, all with rifles. Another shot kicked up dust near Chayton's horse. Kincaid's voice boomed down at them, distorted by the echo. He wanted the Apache. He yelled. He wanted him alive, and he wanted the woman's saddlebag. He told them to throw down their guns. There was nowhere to run. They were pinned down, exposed. Chayton leaped from his horse, pulling his rifle free, and dragged his father behind the relative cover of the fallen mare. He returned fire, a single, quick shot that made the men on the rim duck for cover. Eliza's mind went cold and clear. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She slid from her buckskin, the Spencer carbine feeling solid and reassuring in her hands. She scrambled behind a jumble of large boulders, the oilskin pouch with her precious papers a heavy weight in her saddlebag. She could hear Kincaid shouting orders, telling 2 of his men to work their way down the side of the canyon to get behind them. She remembered Chayton's lesson. Breathe out. Do not fight the rifle. Guide the bullet. She rested the heavy barrel of the Spencer on a flat rock, found Kincaid in her sights. He was standing recklessly, directing his men, certain of his victory. She let her breath out in a long, slow stream and squeezed the trigger. The carbine bucked against her shoulder, high above. Kincaid cried out and staggered back, grabbing at his good arm. Her shot had torn through the flesh of his bicep. It was not a fatal wound, but it was a shocking one. The woman he had come to terrorize was fighting back. The shot drew the fire of the other men. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her, sending chips of stone flying. In that moment of distraction, her horse, spooked by the noise and the smell of gunpowder, reared violently and bolted, scrambling away down the canyon. Her saddlebag, with the oilskin pouch, was still attached. Desperate, Eliza broke cover, running after the horse. It was a foolish move, and she knew it instantly. One of the men on the canyon floor, seeing his chance, took aim at her. She would never have made it, but Chayton moved like lightning. He left the cover of the dead horse, firing his own rifle from the hip to keep the men on the rim occupied. He reached her in 3 long strides, just as her fleeing mare stumbled on the loose rock and went down with a sickening crash. Chayton grabbed Eliza, half throwing her behind his own Mustang, shielding her with his body. He swung up into his saddle and pulled her up behind him in a single, fluid motion. He kicked the Mustang into a gallop, not back the way they had come, but straight toward a sheer wall of rock at a bend in the canyon. Eliza clung to him, convinced he had gone mad, that he meant to dash them to pieces. But at the last second, she saw it a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock, a dark opening just wide enough for a single horse to pass through. It was a hidden trail, a secret known only to the people who had traveled this land for centuries. They plunged into the darkness of the passage, the sound of gunfire and enraged shouts fading behind them. They emerged a few minutes later into a different world, a small, high valley hidden from the main pass. They were safe, for the moment. Chayton brought the horse to a halt. Eliza slid to the ground, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion. She looked back at the canyon. Her buckskin mare was gone, along with the saddlebag, her shield, the lawyer's letter. The hope for her land had been lost in the fight. Chayton dismounted and went immediately to the travois, which they had managed to cut free. Red Clay was alive, but his face was ashen, and his breathing was a shallow, painful whisper. The violent jolt of the fall had been too much for his weakened body. He was weaker now than he had ever been. They had escaped the ambush, but Eliza had lost her claim, and Chayton was losing his father. The victory in Devil's Cut felt very much like a defeat. The hidden valley was a cup of deep shadow and silver light, a secret world cradled in the arms of the high mesas. The Apache Trail had delivered them into a place that felt untouched by the violence of the world below. A small, clear creek, born from some hidden spring high in the rock, trickled through a grove of ancient, twisted pines. The air, washed clean by the recent storm, smelled of wet earth and pine sap. It was a place of peace, a stark and almost painful contrast to the chaos and gunfire of Devil's Cut. They made a cold camp in the deepest shadows of the pines, unwilling to risk a fire. Chayton settled his father against the trunk of a tree, propping him up with their bedrolls. Red Clay had fallen into a deep, still sleep that was more stupor than rest, his face a pale, serene mask in the moonlight. His breathing was shallow, a faint whisper of life. Chayton tended to him with a quiet, desperate tenderness, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, forcing a few drops of water between his cracked lips. Eliza took care of the Mustang, rubbing the lathered sweat from its flanks, checking its legs for injuries. The loss of her own mare, her steady buckskin, was a sharp, physical ache, and the loss of the saddlebag was a deeper, colder wound. The papers, her one legal weapon against Silas Crowell, were gone, lying in the dust of the canyon, likely already in E.P.H. Kincaid's triumphant hands. A wave of hopelessness, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. They had escaped with their lives, but she felt as if she had been stripped bare, her defenses torn away, leaving her with nothing but her own two hands to fight with. She looked at Chayton. He had finished tending to his father and was now standing at the edge of the trees, a silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky, watching the narrow entrance to their hidden sanctuary. He was a guardian, a protector. He had saved her life, shielding her with his own body without a moment's hesitation. And, in his father's warning, she had been given a glimpse of the man behind the stone-faced warrior, a man who had been hurt so badly he had walled off his own heart to survive. The grime of the journey felt caked onto her skin. She was covered in a fine layer of dust, streaked with sweat, and she could see a smear of dried blood on her forearm from a scratch she'd taken scrambling over the rocks. It was the filth of the ambush, the residue of fear and violence, and she knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that she could not bear it for another minute. To sit here in defeat, feeling broken and dirty, was to let Kincaid win. She needed to wash it all away. Not just the dirt, but the feeling of being a victim. She walked over to Chayton. "I am going to the creek," she said, her voice low but steady, "to bathe." He turned, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. He understood. This was not about comfort. It was about reclaiming some small piece of herself. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "I will watch." He turned his back to the creek, positioning himself between her and the trail, a silent, unmovable protector. His respect for her was a physical presence, a shield as real as the rock walls around them. It was a gesture of trust that made her own heart ache with a feeling she had been suppressing for days, a feeling that was as terrifying and as powerful as the ambush had been. The creek had hollowed out a small pool among a cluster of immense, smooth boulders. The moonlight poured into the clearing, turning the water's surface into a sheet of hammered silver. It was achingly beautiful. a place of profound peace. Eliza peeled off her dusty, torn clothes, the rough fabric scraping against her skin. She was shivering, from the cold night air and from the raw, exposed state of her own emotions. For a moment, she held the thick wool blanket she had brought, ready to wrap it around herself, to hide. But who was she hiding from Chayton, who had seen her at her most frightened and her most fierce, or herself? And the truth of what was growing between them in this crucible of violence and desperation, she had lost the papers that defined her claim to her land. She had lost her horse. She had lost her fragile sense of security. All she had left was the truth of who she was. Right now, in this moment, hiding felt like the last and most profound lie. With a deep, shuddering breath, she let the blanket fall to the ground. She walked to the edge of the pool, her bare feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. She stood for a long moment, the cool air on her skin, the silver moonlight bathing her. She was not a girl, naive and unscarred. She was a woman. Her body was strong from years of hard labor, her shoulders broad, her hands calloused. There were faint scars on her legs from a fall, a pale line on her ribs from a branding iron accident years ago. It was the body of a woman who had lived, who had fought, who had survived, and in the pure, honest light of the moon, she did not feel shame. She felt a quiet, defiant pride. She was still here. She was still whole. She waded into the pool. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt that stole her breath and then filled her with a rush of life. It was a baptism in the wild heart of the land. She washed the dust from her hair, the grime from her skin, the memory of her enemy's touch from her world. She felt the tension in her muscles begin to unclench, the knot of fear in her stomach slowly loosening its grip. She was washing away the fight, preparing herself for the one that was to come. When she stepped out of the water, her skin glowing and beaded with silver drops, she felt reborn. She reached for the blanket, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was a faint sound, the shifting of a pebble under his boot. Or perhaps it was something else, an invisible thread of connection that pulled at him. Chayton turned. He saw her, not as a body, not as an object of desire, but as the embodiment of everything he had just fought to protect. He saw the strength in her stance, the courage in her unguarded vulnerability. He saw the moonlight on her skin and the starlight in her eyes. He saw the woman who had stood up to a corrupt sheriff, who had fought beside him with a rifle in her hands, who had tended to his father with a gentle heart. He saw the whole of her, the fierce and the soft, the scarred and the beautiful. And the stone wall around his heart did not just crack, it shattered. The pain of his past, the betrayals, the losses, the reasons he had sworn never to let anyone get close again, all of it crumbled to dust in the face of this one, impossibly brave woman. He felt a surge of emotion so powerful it was like a physical blow. A feeling of awe, of reverence, of a love so fierce it terrified him. It was a love that would undo him, that would remake him into the man his father wanted him to be. He took a step toward her, his breath catching in his throat. He whispered, the words a raw, ragged prayer in the profound quiet of the valley. Sweet mercy, you'll ruin me. The words were an admission, a surrender, a declaration. He walked to her then, and when he reached her, he did not grab or take. He gently took the blanket from the ground and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering, his touch conveying a universe of unspoken feeling. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She had never felt so safe, so utterly and completely seen. He tilted her chin up, his gaze searching hers, asking a question for which he already knew the answer. She gave a small nod, a silent consent that came from the deepest part of her soul. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, profound recognition. It was a kiss of promises made in the heart of the wilderness, a kiss that sealed their fates together. It was a kiss that tasted of pine and moonlight, and the clean, cold water of the creek. He lifted her into his arms, his hold sure and steady, and carried her back to the deep shadows of the pines. There, in the hidden sanctuary they had found, they created a new one, a shelter made not of wood or stone, but of shared trust and a love forged in the heart of the fire. The world outside, with its greed and its violence, faded away, leaving only the truth of two people who had found in each other the one thing they had both thought was lost forever, a home. The journey away from the hidden valley was a slow, deliberate retreat from a dream. The silvered moonlight and the scent of pine were replaced by the harsh glare of the sun and the endless, gritty taste of dust. The intimacy they had found was a fragile, living thing they now carried with them, a secret ember cupped against the harsh winds of the real world. They traveled with a shared, unspoken purpose, their movements synchronized, their glances conveying whole conversations. They were no longer just a woman and a man. They were a partnership, a fortress of two. Red Clay was failing. The jolt and terror of the ambush had shaken the last of the strength from his body. He drifted in and out of consciousness on the travois, which Chayton had repaired and now pulled behind his own Mustang. During his lucid moments, he did not speak of his pain, but watched them, his eyes filled with a deep, quiet knowing. He saw the change in his son, the softening of the stone around his heart, and he saw the fierce, protective strength in Eliza. And sometimes he would nod, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of peace, as if he had seen the one thing he needed to see before his own long journey ended. They did not dare take the main trails. Chayton led them through a network of arroyos and game trails that Eliza, for all her years on this land, had never known existed. It was a slower, harder path, but it was a safe one. On the third day, as they rested the horse in the shade of a rock outcropping, a rider appeared on the horizon, not with the heavy, menacing presence of a posse, but the easy, loping grace of a single horseman. Chayton was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, but Eliza put a calming hand on his arm. "It is Miguel," she said, a wave of relief washing over her. Miguel Ortega rode up, his weathered face a mask of worry that broke into a relieved grin when he saw them. He had been looking for them for 2 days, ever since word of the ambush at Devil's Cut had reached him. Carried by a prospector who had seen the aftermath, he had feared the worst. His eyes took in the scene, Red Clay, pale and still on the travois, and the new, undeniable bond between Eliza and Chayton. He asked no questions about it, his vaquero courtesy as deep and unshakable as the mesas. But his news from Cedar Mesa was grim. The story had been twisted into a monstrous lie. Vance and Kincaid were telling everyone that Chayton had led a raid, ambushing an innocent freight wagon, and that Eliza Hart had been his willing accomplice, a woman bewitched and turned against her own kind. Crowell was using the chaos as a pretext, declaring that the ranch was a public menace, a haven for outlaws, and that for the good of the community, he was seizing it to settle her brother's debt. They were not just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their names, for the very memory of who they were. They decided, in a low, urgent conference, that Miguel's ranch was no longer the goal. The fight was at Hart's Spring. To run would be to admit guilt. They would go back. They would make their stand on her land, under her roof. They arrived back at the ranch at dusk, traveling the last few miles with a cold, creeping dread. The place felt wrong. The usual evening sounds, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of a horse in the barn, were absent. A heavy, expectant silence hung in the air. As they drew closer, they saw why. The ground was churned and trampled with the tracks of at least a dozen horses. They had circled the property, staked it out, and were waiting. They had barely gotten Red Clay inside the cabin and barred the door when the riders returned, their forms dark shapes emerging from the twilight. They surrounded the cabin, a ring of armed men, a voice thick with whiskey and rage, roared through the gloom. It was Sheriff Vance. He was not alone. Silas Crowell sat on a fine black horse just behind him, a silent, imposing figure, and with them was a posse of men from town, their faces a mixture of fear, greed, and the ugly excitement of a mob. Eliza recognized some of them men who had shared a drink with her brother, men whose wives had bought her surplus milk. Now they held rifles, their faces turned against her. Vance unrolled a piece of paper, a theatrical gesture in the failing light. "Chayton Nez," he bellowed. "I have a warrant for your arrest, issued by the authority of the New Mexico Territory, for the crimes of armed robbery, assault, and inciting a riot." Crowell's voice cut in then, smooth and cold as river stone. "And Eliza Hart," he said, his voice carrying with effortless power. "Due to these unfortunate activities, which constitute a clear and present danger to your neighbors, I am forced to call your brother's note. The property of Hart Spring is now forfeit. You have 1 hour to vacate." The two prongs of the trap had sprung. One man held the false authority of the law, the other, the cold power of money. Together, they meant to crush her. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, the Spencer carbine held loosely in her hands. She stood in the doorway, framed by the light from the cabin, refusing to be a shadow in her own home. There was no robbery. "Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing out in the stillness, "there was an ambush, led by your deputy, E.P.H. Kincaid. As for the riot, the only riot I see is the one you have brought to my doorstep." She turned her gaze to Crowell. "And as for my brother's note, you know as well as I do that the terms of that loan are illegal. A contract based on usury is not enforceable in this territory. And you know it." She was bluffing. The proof was gone, but she spoke with the unshakable conviction of the truth. And this land, Silas, and the water that gives it life, belong to me, secured by the law of prior appropriation. My family was here first. The water is mine. You have no claim here. A murmur went through the posse. They were simple men, for the most part, and they understood the law of water. Her words, spoken with such certainty, planted a seed of doubt. Vance, drunk and enraged at being challenged, was having none of it. He drew his pistol. "That is enough out of you," he roared. "You are obstructing justice." He fired a shot into the air, a signal. The night exploded into a sporadic, terrifying chaos. It was not a full battle. It was a war of nerves. A shot would ring out, splintering the porch railing. Another would shatter the window pane. They were not trying to kill them. Not yet. They were trying to break them, to fill the small cabin with so much terror that they would come out with their hands in the air. Inside, Chayton moved with a calm, deadly purpose. He placed Eliza in the most protected corner of the room and took up a position where he could cover both the door and the remaining window, firing a single careful shot every few minutes to remind the men outside that they were not shooting at an empty building. In the midst of the noise and the fear, a soft, frail voice cut through the turmoil. It was Red Clay. He was awake, his eyes lucid and calm. The end, he knew, was here. He looked at his son, and the fear in his eyes was not of death, but for the soul of the man he was leaving behind. "My son," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Do not let them fill your heart with their noise. Sing for me. Sing the song of the journey home." The gunfire seemed to fade into a distant, meaningless roar. The world shrank to this one small, sacred space. Chayton looked at his father, his warrior's face breaking with a wave of grief and love. He knelt by the cot, laying his rifle aside. He took his father's thin hand in his own, and he began to sing. The song was not a cry of war or a lament of sorrow. It was older than that, as old as the mountains and the stars. It was a low, resonant chant, a melody that spoke of the turning of seasons, of the long walk of his people, of the spirit web that connected all things. The words were in the Apache tongue, but their meaning was universal. It was a song of farewell, of a spirit being released back into the great, silent heart of the world. Outside, the shooting faltered, then stopped. The men in the posse lowered their rifles, confused. The song poured from the cabin, a sound of such profound, ancient peace that it made their own violence feel cheap and ugly. It was the sound of a sacred thing happening, and they had a sudden, shameful feeling of being trespassers. Deputy Tom Calder, a young man who had joined the sheriff's office to earn a steady wage, not to terrorize a woman in her home, felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the cabin, then at the drunken, hate-filled face of Sheriff Vance, and for the first time, he saw with perfect clarity which side he was on. The song was a prayer, and he was part of a blasphemy. Inside the cabin, as the last note of the song faded into the quiet, Red Clay let out a long, soft breath. A look of peace settled on his features. His eyes, fixed on his son's face, slowly glazed over. The storyteller was gone. Chayton remained kneeling for a long time, his head bowed, his father's hand still in his. The silence that followed was deeper and more profound than the one before the song. Outside, the spell was broken. Vance, furious that his mob had lost its nerve, began to shout again, but the fire was gone from them. Men began to mutter amongst themselves, shifting uncomfortably. They had come for an arrest, not to lay siege to a man's deathbed. Vance, seeing he had lost them, let out a final, furious roar. "Fine," he yelled. "We will be back, at dawn, and we are bringing the whole town with us. We will see how you stand against all of Cedar Mesa." He wheeled his horse around and, with Crowell and Kincaid at his side, rode off into the darkness. The posse dissolved, melting away in twos and threes, their shoulders slumped, their faces no longer filled with mob fury, but with a dawning, troubled shame. The night was quiet again, but it was the quiet of a ticking clock. They had a few hours until dawn, a few hours until the final battle. Miguel was the first to speak. "I will ride," he said. "Now, I will bring Mistress Chen, and the Reverend. They will listen to the Reverend Burke." Eliza nodded, her mind already racing. "The telegraph office. Miguel, we need to send a wire to Santa Fe, to the United States Marshal's office. His name is Whitaker." Chayton finally looked up from his father's side. His face was etched with grief, but his eyes were clear, hard as obsidian. The stone was back, but it was different now. It was not a wall to hide behind. It was a foundation. His father had given him one last gift, a moment of peace in the heart of the storm, a reminder of who he was. Now, he would fight, not just for his life, but for the world his father had believed in, a world where a song was more powerful than a gun. The small group of allies began to plan, their voices low and urgent in the lamplit cabin, the body of the peaceful storyteller lying in their midst. They had no army. They had only the truth, and they had until dawn to find a way to make it heard. Dawn broke cold and gray over Hart's Spring, painting the landscape in shades of ash and bone. The night had been a long vigil, a quiet, shared space of grief and grim resolve. They attended to Red Clay's body with a gentle, loving reverence, wrapping him in the finest of Eliza's blankets. His journey was over, but theirs was just beginning. There was no time to mourn. Dawn was the deadline Vance had given them, and they would not wait for him to bring the war back to their door. They would take it to his... They rode out as the first rays of sun touched the tops of the mesas, not as fugitives, but as sovereigns of their own small, besieged nation. Eliza rode Chayton's powerful Mustang, her back straight, the Spencer carbine resting in a saddle scabbard. Chayton rode double with Miguel, a silent, imposing figure whose grief had been forged overnight into a hard, diamond-like purpose. They were not running from a mob. They were riding to confront a town with its own reflection. Cedar Mesa was already awake, a nervous, buzzing hornet's nest. A crowd had gathered in the wide, dusty space between the sheriff's office and the general store. It was the entire town. It seemed ranchers in worn denim, merchants in stiff collars, women in their Sunday bonnets, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a dark, simmering excitement. On the porch of his office, Sheriff Vance was holding court. He was already drunk, his face flushed, his voice a gravelly roar that carried across the square. He held a rifle in one hand and a bottle in the other, a perfect portrait of tyranny gone to seed. He was feeding the crowd a raw, bloody meal of fear and hatred. He spoke of savage raiders, of a lone woman led astray, her mind poisoned against her own people. He twisted their story into a threat to every home, every family in Cedar Mesa. Silas Crowell stood beside him, a stark contrast in his fine, dark coat. He was sober, his face calm, his arms crossed over his chest. He was the mind, letting Vance be the rabid dog on the leash. He let the sheriff stoke the flames, knowing that in the chaos, the one thing everyone would forget to question was his own quiet, legal-looking theft of the most valuable resource in the territory, Eliza's water. The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing angrier, their faces hardening. They were a dry field, and Vance was a lit match. Then, a gasp went through the assembly. From the south end of the street, two riders appeared, Eliza and Miguel, with Chayton seated behind him. They did not gallop. They came at a slow, deliberate walk, their approach a direct, undeniable challenge. The crowd, for all its bluster, parted before them, a silent, shuffling wave. They rode into the center of the square and stopped, the dust settling around them. They were outnumbered 100-1, but for a long moment, the sheer audacity of their arrival held the entire town in a stunned silence. Vance was the first to recover, his drunken rage boiling over. He pointed a trembling finger at them. "There they are," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "The savage killer and the woman who beds down with him. Come to burn your town after they rob your wagons." Eliza swung down from the Mustang, her movements fluid and sure. She did not raise her voice. She let it carry, clear and cold as spring water, into the unnatural quiet. "The only killer I see, Sheriff, is the one who leads a drunken mob to a woman's home in the dead of night. The only thief I see is the man who would use your badge to steal her land." Before Vance could retort, a new voice, quiet but firm, cut through the air. "She speaks the truth." A path opened in the crowd, and Mistress Lian Chen walked through it. She was, as always, immaculate, her expression serene. In her hands, she held a sheaf of papers. She walked to Eliza's side, a small, unshakable island of calm in a sea of hostility. "Sheriff Vance," she said, her voice never rising, yet commanding the attention of every person there. "You have made accusations based on a lie. I hold here a copy of a letter from a federal attorney in Santa Fe. It confirms that the loan document held by Mr. Crowell is illegal. It confirms that the water rights to Hart Spring belong to the Hart family by law." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And I also hold here sworn affidavits, delivered to me by a trusted friend from the San Carlos agency, detailing the theft of government supplies of beef and flour that were sold to minors, while men like Red Clay, a man who died in this woman's home only last night, were left to starve." A new and different murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not about race or fear. This was about law, about paper and ink, about a corruption that many of them had long suspected but had never seen laid so bare. Then, another figure pushed his way to the front. It was Reverend Josiah Burke, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes filled with a terrible, righteous fire. He climbed onto the steps of the general store, his hands shaking, not with fear, but with the force of a confession that could no longer be contained. "I have been a coward," he announced, his voice trembling with emotion. "For months, I have listened to the whispers of this town. I have listened to the poison of prejudice, and I have remained silent. I have preached the word of God in my church, and then stood by while the laws of God and man were mocked in this very square. His voice grew stronger, a preacher finding his true sermon. My silence was a sin. My silence was complicity. Last night, I was called to a home where a good man was dying, and his son was singing him home to his Creator, and outside that home, our sheriff was leading a mob. I ask you to look. Look at Eliza Hart. Is that the face of a criminal? Look at this man. Chayton. Is that the face of a savage? Or is it the face of a son mourning his father? I have been blind, and I have been silent. No more. The crowd was wavering, the hard shell of their certainty cracking. They looked from the tormented face of the preacher to the calm, resolute faces of Eliza and Chayton, and then to the furious, drunken face of their sheriff. And they were no longer sure who the monsters were. The final crack came from within the sheriff's own office. Deputy Tom Calder stepped out onto the porch. He looked young, out of his depth, his face pale. He unpinned the tin star from his vest, his movements clumsy. He held it in his palm for a moment, then threw it into the dust of the street. "He is lying," Calder said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stunned silence. All of it. There was no robbery. Sheriff Vance ordered me and EPH Kincaid to provoke a fight with the Apache, to find any reason to bring him in. The siege last night, it was not law. It was a personal vendetta. I will not be a part of it anymore. Vance stared at his deputy, his mouth agape, his authority crumbling around him like a sandcastle in the tide. He was exposed, his lies stripped bare in front of the entire town. It was into this tableau of broken power that a new rider appeared. He rode in from the north, not on a tired cow pony, but on a big, powerful bay gelding. He was an older man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and calm, gray eyes that seemed to take in the entire scene at a single glance. A United States Marshal's star was pinned to his coat. He did not hurry. He rode his horse directly through the crowd, which parted for him as if by magic. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office, his gaze resting on Vance with a look of weary disappointment. "Asa," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through all other sound. "It seems you have been busy." He swung down from his horse. "I got a telegraph message about an hour ago. Seems you are interfering with a federal witness." He turned his calm, assessing gaze on Chayton. "Are you Chayton Nez?" Chayton gave a slow, dignified nod. "Marshal Whitaker," the man said. "I have been looking for you. Your testimony regarding the criminal activities at the San Carlos Indian Agency is required by the United States government. As of this moment, you are in my protective custody." He then looked directly at Vance, "which makes your little posse here an act of obstruction of federal justice, a serious crime." "Asa." The last of the fight went out of Vance. He seemed to shrink, the drunken bluster draining away, leaving only a pathetic, defeated old man. But Silas Crowell was not defeated. He was a cornered wolf, and he had one last set of teeth. He stepped forward, his voice a blade of ice. "Marshal, this man is no witness. He is a murderer. Ask him where he and his people were a week ago, when the Payton family, a man, his wife, and 2 small children, were slaughtered out at Miller's Wash." A fresh wave of horror and rage went through the crowd. The Payton massacre was a raw, open wound on the community's soul. All eyes turned to Chayton, the old hatred flaring back to life. Before Chayton could speak, Miguel Ortega stepped forward, leading his horse. He was no orator, no lawyer. He was a man of the earth, and his evidence came from the earth itself. He pointed a long, calloused finger at Silas Crowell. "The men who killed the Paytons were riders on shod horses," Miguel said, his voice loud and clear. "I was one of the first men there. I saw the tracks. They were not the tracks of an unshod Apache pony. They were the tracks of heavy horses, shod in the Texas style, with a high caulk on the heel." He paused, letting every man who had ever shod a horse picture the mark. "It is an old rustler's trick. It is also the same shoe you use on all your own horses. Crowell, the same horses your man Kincaid was riding when he led the ambush in Devil's Cut. The accusation, so specific, so expert, so undeniable, hung in the air. It was the final, devastating blow. The crowd turned as one, their faces no longer filled with fear of the Apache, but with a cold, dawning fury at the man who had lived among them, who had manipulated them, and who had used their darkest fears to cover his own bloody crimes. Marshal Whitaker's face was grim. He had seen enough. "Asa Vance," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you are under arrest." He looked at the stunned Tom Calder. "Mr. Calder, I am reinstating you as deputy. For now, place this man in his own cell." He then turned his cold, gray eyes on Crowell. "As for you, sir, I would advise you not to leave town." He scanned the crowd. "I am also issuing a warrant for the arrest of one E.P.H. Kincaid, for attempted murder, and for questioning in the deaths of the Peyton family." The sun was fully up now, bathing the town square in a clear, honest light. The mob had dissolved, replaced by a community that had been forced to witness its own near damnation, and had, at the last possible second, stepped back from the brink. The reign of Asa Vance was over. The shadow of Silas Crowell was broken. Justice, in the clear light of day, had finally come to Cedar Mesa. The harsh, clarifying light of the town square gave way to the soft, sorrowful light of late afternoon back at Hart Spring. The confrontation had been a public spectacle of justice, a loud and necessary breaking of a fever. But this was a quiet, private act of love and farewell. There was a small hill just east of the cabin, a gentle rise crowned with a single, wind-sculpted juniper. It looked out over the vast expanse of the plains, toward the distant mountains where the sun was born each morning. This was where they chose to lay Red Clay to rest. There was no coffin, no preacher. There was only the earth, the sky, and the small group of people who had become his final family. Miguel had helped Chayton dig the grave, their shovels sinking into the dry, rocky soil with a steady, rhythmic grit. Now, they stood beside it, the silence broken only by the low whisper of the wind through the juniper's branches. Chayton gently lowered his father's body, wrapped in the clean white blanket, into the earth. His movements were deliberate, imbued with a sacred dignity. He knelt at the head of the grave and opened a small leather pouch he wore around his neck. From it, he took a single, perfect eagle feather, its edges tipped with white. He laid it gently on his father's chest. It was a symbol of courage, of wisdom, of a spirit that could soar to the highest heavens. Then he took a pinch of dark, rich earth from the pouch, earth he had carried from their ancestral lands, and sprinkled it over the blanket, a final tether to the spirit web, a promise that he would never be disconnected from his home. Then Eliza stepped forward. She hesitated for only a moment before removing a simple silver ring from her finger. It had been her mother's, the only piece of fine jewelry she owned. It was a plain, unadorned band, worn smooth by the years. It was a symbol of her own lineage, of the love and strength that had been passed down to her. She knelt beside Chayton and placed the ring in Red Clay's still hand, folding his fingers around it. It was a gesture that transcended language, a joining of two families, two histories, in the shared ground of grief and respect. They stood together, their shoulders brushing, and made a silent vow. The story of Red Clay, of his quiet courage and his fight against the slow, grinding injustice of the agency, would not be buried here. They would carry it with them. They would take it to Santa Fe, to the marshal, to anyone who would listen. His life and his death would have meaning beyond this lonely hill. They filled the grave together, the soft thud of earth on the blanket a final, somber drumbeat. When they were finished, they stood for a long time, watching as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple. The raw, open wound of the day was beginning to scar over, promising a future, however uncertain. They returned to the cabin in the bruised light of dusk, a shared, bone-deep weariness settling over them. Miguel had brought in some of Eliza's cattle that had scattered, his presence a quiet, comforting anchor. The immediate threat seemed to be over. Vance was in a cell. Crowell was a pariah in his own town, and the marshal's authority was a solid shield around them. They allowed themselves a moment of fragile peace, the first in what felt like a lifetime. But the serpent was not yet dead. It had been wounded, its head bruised, but it still had one last drop of venom. The attack came as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon. There was no warning, no shouted taunts, only the sudden, whooshing roar of fire. A flaming torch arced through the twilight and landed on the dry shingles of the barn roof. In an instant, the old, weathered wood caught, and flames began to lick their way toward the sky. Chayton and Miguel were out of the cabin in a flash, grabbing buckets. But as they ran toward the barn, a rifle shot kicked up dirt at their feet. It was a trap. E.P.H. Kincaid stepped out from behind the corral, a rifle in his hands and a look of pure, nihilistic rage on his face. His arm was still in a sling, but he held the rifle steady with his good hand. Two other men, hired guns Eliza did not recognize, emerged from the shadows with him. They were not here to intimidate. They were here to destroy. If Crowell was going down, he was going to make sure there was nothing left of Heart Spring to save. One of the men carried a heavy pickaxe, and he began to smash at the small, carefully built irrigation ditch that carried water from the spring to Eliza's meager garden. It was a fight born of desperation and instinct. Eliza, inside the cabin, did not panic. She grabbed the Spencer carbine. The fight in Devil's Cut, the siege the night before, had burned away the last of her fear, leaving a core of cold, hard resolve. She remembered Chayton's lessons. She remembered the dying sun. She smashed the glass of the remaining window with the butt of the rifle. The men outside were facing east, toward the burning barn. The setting sun was directly behind her, a blinding ball of orange fire. When she poked the barrel of the Spencer through the broken window, they would be looking straight into the glare. Chayton and Miguel had taken cover behind the water trough, pinned down. Kincaid was yelling, his voice raw with fury, telling them to come out and die. Just then, a strange, mournful sound echoed from the hills behind the cabin. It was the low, powerful blast of a vaquero's horn, a sound used to call cattle from long distances. Miguel's eyes widened. He had given his own horn to Eliza's brother years ago. He knew she kept it on the mantelpiece. The sound, unexpected and alien, startled Kincaid and his men. For a fraction of a second, they turned toward the sound, wondering if a whole troop of riders was about to descend on them. It was the opening they needed. Chayton rose from behind the trough, firing not at Kincaid, but at the man with the pickaxe, his shot hitting the man's leg and sending him down with a howl of pain. At the same moment, Eliza fired from the window, blinded by the setting sun. Kincaid did not even see where the shot came from. The bullet tore through the wood of the corral fence next to his head, sending splinters into his face. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. Miguel, a coil of rope in his hand, moved with a speed that belied his years. He swung the lariat in a single, fluid motion. The loop sailed through the air and settled perfectly over Kincaid's head and shoulders, pinning his good arm to his side. Before Kincaid could recover, Miguel had pulled the rope taut, and the hired gun was on the ground, disarmed and helpless. The third man, seeing his leader down and his partner wounded, threw down his rifle and raised his hands in the air. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. It had not been a glorious battle, but a short, brutal, and practical affair of tactics and timing. They tied Kincaid securely to one of his own saddle horses. Under the cold, menacing stare of Chayton and the weight of his own defeat, his bluster evaporated, replaced by a desperate, whining self-preservation. He started talking. He told them everything. How Crowell had paid him and his men to disguise themselves as Apache raiders. How the Peyton family had not been a target, but had accidentally stumbled upon them altering the brands on a herd of stolen cattle. and had to be silenced. How Crowell had orchestrated the entire campaign of terror against Eliza, all to get his hands on her water. It was a full and complete confession, a final, ugly epitaph for Silas Crowell's empire. They sent Miguel into town with the prisoners and the confession. "Marshal Whitaker," he said, "would be very interested to hear it." As Miguel rode off, Eliza and Chayton stood together, watching the last of the flames from the barn roof die down. They had saved the structure, but the scars were deep, just like their own. News traveled fast in the territory. By the next morning, they heard the end of the story from Tom Calder, who rode out personally to tell them. Silas Crowell had not waited for the marshal to come for him. He had tried to run. He had pushed his horse to a full gallop, heading for the old wooden bridge that crossed the river south of town. But Marshal Whitaker had anticipated his move. He was waiting on the other side. Crowell saw him and tried to wheel his horse around on the bridge. The animal, already panicked, shied violently. A rotten plank gave way under its flailing hooves. There was a scream of terror from both man and horse, and then a great, splintering crash. There was no final speech, no dramatic showdown, just the cold, impartial justice of gravity and rotten wood. Silas Crowell's greed had built him a kingdom, and in the end, it had swallowed him whole. The seasons turned, and the land, which had been a witness to so much violence and sorrow, began to heal. The first rains of late autumn came, washing the dust from the air and settling the ghosts that had haunted the territory. The water ran clear and strong in the creek at Hart's Spring, no longer marked by the angry red X of a thief. In Cedar Mesa, a different kind of cleansing was underway. The fall of Silas Crowell and Asa Vance was as swift and as total as their reign had been absolute. With Kincaid's confession, Crowell's empire of fear and stolen land crumbled into ruin. His assets were seized by the territorial courts, his vast herds broken up and sold at auction to smaller ranchers who had long been choked by his shadow. The name Crowell, once spoken with a mixture of fear and envy, was now a curse, a cautionary tale told in low voices in the saloon. Asa Vance was stripped of his badge and his dignity, left to await a territorial judge in his own jail cell, a sour, pathetic figure tended to by the very man he had once held in contempt. Tom Calder wore the sheriff's star now, and he wore it with a quiet, unshakable gravity. He did not strut or boast. He simply did his job. His creed a simple one, he stated to the town council the law would be the same for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their wallet. It was a novel idea in Cedar Mesa, and it was the beginning of a hard, slow healing. The journey to Santa Fe was not a flight, but a pilgrimage. Eliza and Chayton rode side by side, not as fugitives, but as witnesses. Marshal Whitaker had provided them with an escort, but it felt more like an honor guard than a protective detail. In the territorial capital, a city of old adobe and new American ambition, their voices were finally heard in a place of power. Eliza, armed with the legal papers Mistress Chen had managed to recover from her abandoned saddlebag, gave her testimony with a clear, unwavering voice. She spoke of the illegal loan, of the campaign of intimidation, and of her legal right to her water. The officials listened, their faces grim, and when she was finished, her claim to Hart's Spring was recorded and stamped with the seal of the territory, making it as solid and as permanent as the land itself. Chayton's testimony was a quieter, more devastating affair. He spoke before a federal commission investigating the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He did not speak with anger, but with a profound, sorrowful clarity. He told the story of his father. He spoke of the spoiled flour, the threadbare blankets, the slow, deliberate starvation of a proud people. He laid the truth bare, and the commission, for once, was forced to listen. The agent at the San Carlos reservation was removed, and a new one was sent, along with a full allotment of federally mandated supplies. It was not a perfect solution. It did not erase the generations of betrayal, nor did it magically mend the spirit web. But for the first time in a long time, The children would not go to bed hungry. It was not a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning, a small patch of earth where a seed of hope could be planted. They returned to Heart Spring not to a place of siege, but to a home. And in the golden light of an October afternoon, they were married. They had 2 ceremonies, 2 celebrations of the new life they were weaving together. The first was on the hill where red clay was buried. Only Miguel was there to witness. Chayton, dressed in simple, clean buckskin, stood with Eliza before the grave. There were no vows in English. He spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice a low, resonant murmur that blended with the wind. He was not just speaking to her. He was speaking to the land, to the sky, and to the spirit of his father. He was pledging himself to the spirit web and welcoming her into its heart. He placed a simple, beaded bracelet on her wrist, and she, in turn, tied a new silk kerchief, the color of the desert sky, around his neck. They were bound. The second ceremony was in the small, newly swept church in Cedar Mesa. Reverend Burke officiated, his voice no longer filled with fear, but with a deep, resonant joy. The church was not full, but it was not empty. Mistress Chen was there, her face a quiet portrait of happiness. Tom Calder stood as a witness, his new badge gleaming on his chest. Even a few of the townspeople, their faces a mixture of shame and a dawning respect, stood in the back pews, silent observers of the new world being born in their midst. Eliza wore her mother's simple blue dress, and in the quiet of the church, they spoke the old words, their promises echoing in the rafters, a public declaration that love had taken root in the most unlikely of soil. Life settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of building. They combined their names and their skills, and the Nez Heart Ranch was born. They bought a small herd of fine mares with the money Eliza had saved, and Chayton, with his intuitive understanding of horseflesh, began to breed them with his tough Mustang stock. Their goal was to create a new kind of horse, one with the stamina of the wild and the gentle nature of a trained cow pony. The barn was rebuilt, its fire-scarred timbers replaced with new, strong ones. It was larger now, with stalls for the new horses and a hayloft that smelled of sweet alfalfa. They became teachers, in their own quiet way. Children from town, who had once been taught to fear the very sight of an Apache, now came to the ranch on Saturdays. Chayton, patient and calm, taught them how to sit a horse, how to read the clouds for weather, how to listen to the language of the land, and in the evenings, by the fire, Eliza would read to them from books, and Chayton would tell them the old stories, the stories of coyote and eagle, weaving the two worlds together, one child at a time. The first heavy rain of the season came on a cold November night. It drummed a steady, soothing rhythm on the new roof of the cabin, a sound of life, of a deep and abiding peace. Inside, the hearth fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the room. The air was filled with the rich smell of roasting meat and strong coffee. The scars were still there, a long, pale line on the door where Kincaid's bullet had struck, the memory of the fire in the rafters of the barn, the quiet ache in their hearts for the old storyteller who slept on the hill. But the wounds were no longer raw. Eliza sat at the table, mending a tear in one of Chayton's shirts. Her fingers brushed against the small leather pouch he had given her, the one that held the sacred earth from his father's grave. She wore it always, a constant, silent reminder of the journey that had brought them here. Chayton sat on the floor by the fire, working a piece of soft leather with a bone awl, mending a broken rein on a bridle. He looked up, the firelight catching the warmth in his eyes, and saw her watching him. A slow smile touched his lips. "You are quiet tonight," he said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. She smiled back, a playful glint in her eyes. "I was just thinking," she said, "for a man who once told me I would ruin him, you seem to be holding up remarkably well." He let out a soft laugh, a sound that was still new and wonderful to her ears. "I was not wrong," he said, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and as deep as the night sky outside. You did ruin me. You ruined the man of stone who is afraid to feel the sun, and I have never been more grateful in my life. He put down his leatherwork and came to her, kneeling beside her chair, taking her hand in his. The land outside was being washed clean, and inside, by the warm fire, two people who had once been strangers, who had been brought together by a storm of violence and fear, had finally, truly, found their home. It was not a fairy tale. It was something far better. It was hope, with roots. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press that hype button to help our stories reach more ears.